If you're someone who doesn't keep close friendships, you've heard it before. That you're cold, that there's something wrong with you, that someone must have hurt you deeply, as if the absence of friends were automatic proof of a character flaw. Your family asks why you don't make plans on weekends. Your coworkers look confused when you turn down happy hour for the 10th time. And at some point, someone looked at you with that expression that mixes pity with judgment and said, "You're antisocial." Maybe you've even wondered if they're right. But here's what psychology actually says about it. You aren't cold, and you aren't broken, and you are definitely not incapable of connection. Because there is one detail no one talks about. There are three very different types of people who live without close friendships, and they have almost nothing in common with each other. What drives you might be completely different from what drives the person next to you. And confusing these three types is why you've spent years thinking there was something fundamentally wrong with you. But psychology has a name for each one, and the differences between them change everything. You're about to discover which of these types you are. In 2021, the Survey Center on American Life published data that should have made headlines. 12% of Americans claim to have no close friends. In 1990, that number was only 3%. In 3 decades, the phenomenon has quadrupled, and 49% of people report having 3 close friends or fewer. This number exploded after 2020. The pandemic didn't create the phenomenon. It accelerated a trend that already existed and revealed how many people were already living in this state without the words to name it. This isn't collective weakness. It's not a generation that doesn't know how to relate. And it's not a coincidence. Science has already mapped out what is happening, on different fronts, in fact. John Bowlby, the British psychiatrist who founded attachment theory, documented why some human beings systematically pull away from emotional proximity. Mary Ainsworth, his collaborator, mapped the attachment styles we form in childhood and demonstrated how these styles shape every bond we try to build for the rest of our lives. Stephen Porges, an American neuroscientist, went even deeper. Through polyvagal theory, he showed that social engagement isn't a personality choice. It's a state of the nervous system, your nervous system. This isn't an anecdote. This is data. But let's get to what really matters. You've been called cold, antisocial, hard to love. But you aren't cold. You aren't antisocial. And you are definitely not incapable of love. You are someone whose system has learned something. And the difference between these two frameworks is everything. There are 3 groups hiding under the same label, and each has a completely different mechanism behind the behavior. The first group is the burned. Let me paint a picture. Imagine someone who once wanted friendships, someone who made space, invested time, and trusted people, and was let down. Not necessarily in a dramatic way. Sometimes it was a series of small but repeated and accumulated failures. The friend who told your secret. The group that vanished when you truly needed them. The person who stayed as long as it was convenient and disappeared when it wasn't. The human brain is a prediction machine. After enough repetitions, it stops asking the question and starts making the decision for you. Clinical literature has an exact term for what happens to this system. Bowlby and Ainsworth describe this as avoidant attachment, specifically the dismissive avoidance style. It's when the mind learns, through repeated evidence, that proximity equals risk. Not as a conscious decision, but as an update that happens behind the scenes, without your consent. This isn't coldness. This is protection. The second group is the selective. And here comes the plot twist. Because this is the most misunderstood group of all. This person has full capacity for connection. They don't avoid intimacy out of fear. They weren't necessarily betrayed or abandoned. They simply haven't found people who come close to what they consider a real friendship. Others seem superficial, too quick to call someone they met 2 weeks ago a friend, too casual with loyalty and depth. Elaine Aron, the researcher who developed the concept of the highly sensitive person, documented that about 15 to 20% of the population processes social stimuli with unusual depth. For these people, empty small talk doesn't fuel them. It drains them. A friendship that doesn't sustain vulnerability isn't a friendship. It's a performance, and the cost of maintaining performances is too high. This isn't arrogance. This isn't isolation. It's integrity. The third group is the drained. This person doesn't avoid people out of fear or high standards. They avoid them because social interaction costs more energy than they have available to spend. And that's not a metaphor. It's physiology. Stephen Porges discovered that social engagement requires the nervous system to maintain a specific state of regulation. For some nervous systems, especially those operating under chronic demand, maintaining this state for long periods exhausts resources. The body goes into involuntary withdrawal mode to preserve what's left. Think of a battery that recharges in silence, not because connection has no value, but because the energy cost of maintaining it exceeds what the system can sustain continuously. This isn't avoidance. This is self-regulation. Which of these three do you recognize in yourself? The burned, the selective, or the drained? Hold on to that answer, because the next part will explain where this pattern came from, before you even had the words to name anything. But there's a missing piece to this story. Where did this come from? Because it didn't start in adulthood. It started before you even knew what a friend was. John Bowlby concluded, after decades of research, that the attachment pattern a child forms in the first years of life serves as a blueprint for all future relationships. He called it the internal working model, a map the brain creates to predict how people will behave and what is safe to expect from them. This map is formed early, long before you're even aware it exists, and then it operates invisibly, shaping every relational choice you make without you even realizing it. The burned learned this map early. Perhaps love in your childhood was conditional, present when you behaved one way, absent when you didn't. Maybe it was unpredictable, warm one day, distant the next. A child doesn't have the capacity to process emotional inconsistency like an adult, so they draw the only available conclusion. People are variable. Trust is risky. Distance is safer. The selective learned a different way. Perhaps your preferences were repeatedly ignored or minimized. Maybe you were forced to tolerate social environments that overwhelmed you, without anyone acknowledging that it took a real toll on you. The system learned that your relational needs had a different pattern than expected, and that expressing that pattern created friction, so it learned not to express it. The drained learned through overload, a childhood with little real space for recovery, an environment that demanded constant presence and social performance without windows of genuine rest. The nervous system learned that the social world is a place of continuous demand, and it developed a withdrawal reflex as a preservation mechanism. None of this was a decision. It was a conclusion, drawn before you had the vocabulary to question it, before you had the cognitive capacity to consider alternatives. Think about that for a second. Do you recognize the origin of your pattern? Because there's a crucial difference between what this pattern built over time and what it means now. That brings us to the uncomfortable question that almost no one has the courage to ask. Is what you built a boundary or a wall? Because there are two completely different states that look identical from the outside, and only one of them is healthy. A boundary is born of choice. You know what you need, you know what drains you, and you protect your space out of clarity. You can choose connection when it makes sense and decline when it doesn't. Solitude doesn't hurt. It nourishes. A wall is born of fear. It's not that you consciously chose not to have friendships. It's that the idea of trying feels impossible, too risky, or simply out of reach. When someone approaches, the nervous system doesn't sense opportunity. It senses a threat. Solitude in these cases doesn't nourish, it numbs. Research on voluntary solitude, which is different from social isolation, is consistent on this point. People who actively choose fewer but higher quality and more meaningful bonds show higher levels of psychological well-being than the average. This isn't guesswork, it's documented science. But the isolation that comes from the fear of getting hurt, from the belief that you don't deserve connection, that people invariably disappoint, that trying is always an exposure to risk, that isn't protection. That is a wall, built with the conclusions you drew before you were old enough to question them. The difference isn't in how many friends you have, It's in how you feel when faced with the possibility of connection. Do you feel peace when you choose silence? Or do you feel a relief that smells like escape? Let that question land. Because if it bothered you, if you were silent for a moment before answering, that isn't weakness. That's the most honest part of the video. Is it a boundary or is it a wall? Only you know. So let me tell you what psychology says about you. You aren't broken. You aren't cold. You aren't antisocial or incapable of love or damaged beyond repair. You are someone whose nervous system learned to protect itself in a way that the world around you doesn't quite understand. And you've carried that learning for years, silently, without a name, without context. Now you have a name. Now you have context. Maybe you're the burned, someone who built distance after learning time and again that proximity hurts. Maybe you're the selective, someone who refuses superficial connection because what you're looking for is real. Or maybe you're the drained, someone whose system needs silence to keep functioning. You belong to a group the world confuses with coldness, but that psychology recognizes differently. Any of these types is real. Any of these is documented. And none of them is a character flaw. Saber qual tipo você é, não é o destino. É o ponto de partida. Porque agora você pode fazer a pergunta honesta. O que eu construí é uma fronteira ou é uma muralha? If you've ever chosen silence over a social obligation and felt genuine relief, not escape, actual relief, I want to hear about that moment. Leave a comment. I read them all. You don't need to justify yourself to anyone. You don't need 10 friends to prove that you're doing okay. Protect